Official newspaper files of the early West record many stories of famous and notorious characters of that period. Among them, Cattle Kate, born Ella Watson, who operated in Wyoming in the late 1880s. She and her partner in crime, Jim Averill, kept one of the last western frontiers in a state of terror.
I hope our luck holds out.
It will. I'll keep stealing from these big outfits till I break them.
Wait, what? 50s TV westerns aren't exactly known for their historical accuracy, but this is embarrassing. First off, don't call her Cattle Kate. Ellen or Ella Watson never went by that name during her lifetime. There was another gal, she was named Kate, and she got... The point is, Ella Watson was not Cattle Kate. This legend has persisted for literally a century, and it's only in the last few decades that serious researchers have begun uncovering the truth. So the obvious question is, how did this whole Cattle Kate thing come about? Ellen's story perfectly personifies the tension between wealthy cattle owners and homesteaders in late 19th century Wyoming. It begins in 1861, when Ellen is born in Canada to Scottish immigrants. They move to America, Ellen grows up and gets married, husband's an abusive drunk, so Ellen leaves him, and by 1886 she's working in Wyoming. Here she meets James Averill. Averill had come west as a soldier, killed a guy in an argument, been discharged from the army, then lost his wife and child to disease. He had set up a store near the Sweetwater River, just miles from Independence Rock, and Ellen had gotten a job working in his store. Independence Rock and the Sweetwater River had been important landmarks for the Oregon Trail, but by this time it was getting more common for people to use the railroads to cross the country. Averill was making a living, supplying the nearby ranchers, cowboys, and miners with supplies. Among James's neighbors along the Sweetwater were some of the most powerful and influential ranchers in Wyoming, including Tom DeBow Salil, better known as Tom's son, and Albert Bothwell. Bothwell came from a wealthy family and had a vision of building a town named after himself. He tried his hand at investing in a lot of different businesses, but it was cattle that made him the most money. You could say it was his cash cow. I don't care if that's a funny joke or not, I'm leaving it in. Bothwell and most of his fellow ranchers were members of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. The WSGA had formed in 1872 to set rules and regulations for livestock management, organize roundups, and most importantly, deal with cattle rustling. See, when Bothwell had come to Wyoming, the territory was basically a free-for-all. Ranchers just let their cattle loose to graze on the open range and only rounded them up twice a year. There were no land rights or property disputes. Since your cattle was out there, you basically claimed the turf by possession. And this idea would get tested by homesteaders who began setting up on the open range. Generally speaking, the 1862 Homestead Act allowed people to claim up to 160 acres of land, provided they lived on it for a few years, built something on the property, and paid a small processing fee. James Averill was a smart guy. He knew his law and how to use it. James put down his stakes and claimed his land along Horse Creek, an important water source in the area. He and Ellen began planning to get married and even submitted an application for a marriage license, but they decided to game the system. See, if they got married, then Ellen couldn't submit her own land claim. It was like one claim per family. But as a single woman, Ellen could also claim her own land, which she did, right next to James. To this day, it's still unclear if they ever actually married. At any rate, Ellen's claim doubled the real estate that Bothwell couldn't graze his herds on. He approached Ella multiple times and offered to buy her land, but she wouldn't sell. In fact, she would infringe even more on the rancher's turf. According to witnesses, Ella began buying some cattle from travelers heading to Washington and started digging irrigation ditches on her property. This would siphon off more water away from the open range that the other wealthy cattle ranchers depended on. Now, one of the ways the WSGA controlled the cattle trade was through brands. In order for a brand to matter, you had to register it through them and pay every year to keep your brand in good standing. If you were a WSGA rancher's employee, you were automatically forbidden from owning a brand and working your own cattle. And if you tried skirting the rules, you'd be blacklisted by the association. Ellen tried multiple times to obtain a brand for her small herd, but she was constantly denied. Finally, in early 1889, she bought the rights to an existing brand, and towards the end of the spring roundup, she branded her 41 head of cattle. A WSGA cattle detective saw Ellen's herd and claimed it contained stolen cattle. He leaked the info to the ranchers, including Bothwell. This was just the sort of pretense that the cattlemen needed. On Saturday, July 20th, 1889, Ellen and her teenage ranch hand walked toward a nearby Indian camp and bought some things, including, allegedly, a pair of beaded moccasins. On the walk home, as they approached their house, Ellen saw 6 men destroying her fence and setting her animals loose. They forced her into the back of Tom's son's wagon, where Bothwell told her if she resisted, he would rope her and drag her to death. The men said they were taking her to Rawlins to be arrested for cattle theft. Instead, they drove to James Averill's house and confronted him. When Averill asked if they had a warrant, John Durbin pointed his gun in Averill's face and told him, "There is the warrant." Averill was placed in the wagon with Ellen, and the men took them west, along the Sweetwater River. The teenage kid quickly went to get one of Averill's friends, a neighbor named Frank Buchanan, who caught up with the ranchers in their wagon south of Independence Rock. Buchanan fired his revolver at them and hit John Durbin in the hip, but he was driven off by the ranchers' Winchesters. It would be almost 2 days before a sheriff's posse would find Ellen and James's bodies, swaying under a tree. The hangman's drop had been too short to snap their necks, so they had strangled to death on the same branch, close enough to touch each other. A newspaper documented the scene from an eyewitness, stating, "Judging from signs too plain to be mistaken, a desperate struggle had taken place on the cliff, and both man and woman had fought for their lives until the last." In her last moments, Ellen had kicked off her new moccasins, which were found on the ground underneath her. Those moccasins are now housed at the Wyoming State Museum. I'll put a link in the description and a card to another video where you can actually see them. The bodies were taken to a nearby ranch for a coroner's inquest. Afterward, Ellen and James were buried on the ranch, together in the same coffin. There was no mystery who had done it, and the posse immediately went to Tom's son's ranch, where he quickly confessed and named names. The posse then went to Albert Bothwell's place, where he also confessed. The 6 men responsible for the lynchings were all arrested and paid their bonds. What happened next would set a precedent for how the WSGA would handle problems from homesteaders. First, the WSGA relied on loyal reporters and newspapers to publish their version of events. In Cheyenne, the territory's capital, all the newspapers supported the WSGA. In fact, it's almost like they were competing with each other to prove who had the most allegiance to the association. The story quickly went out over the wire and was picked up across the country. By July 23rd, the New York papers published a wildly inaccurate column, where we see Ellen's name changed to Kate Maxwell. There was a woman named Kate Maxwell. She lived west of Ellen Watson and might have been involved in some illegal activities. They were definitely not the same person. But if you blend the identities together, throw in some lurid details to sensationalize your story, and add some content to make your audience feel morally superior, you can sit back and watch the frenzy unfold. Before long, the papers were arguing about exactly how much of a whore Ellen had been. One paper said she collected cattle in exchange for sex, while another said she was just a normal prostitute who paid for her beef just like any other citizen. Was Ellen a prostitute? I don't know. Nobody knows. And as far as the allegations of cattle rustling go against her, it doesn't matter. Second, the ranch owners made sure there wasn't going to be a trial. If you've ever gone to court before, you know it's not about what you know, it's about what you can prove. In the weeks after the 6 suspects were released on bail, the witnesses who could testify against them all died or disappeared. By October, there wasn't a case, and nobody was ever even indicted. Officially, the murder of Ellen Watson and James Averill remains unsolved. Bothwell even took Ellen's 41 cows. Ellen and James's lynching created a blueprint for how the Wyoming Stock Growers Association would handle threats to their organization. Relate their threat to cattle rustling, eliminate that threat, then utilize their friendly press to discredit and smear any opposition. And it worked. The media did such an overwhelming smear job on Ellen and James that for 100 years the Cattle Kate myth became a Wild West staple. Sort of a downer episode. I'm sorry. I guess sometimes life doesn't have a happy ending. But I'll leave you with this. Months after the lynching, a filler story made the Wyoming newspaper rounds. A Carbon County genius has conceived the idea that James Averill and Ella Watson were not hung, and that the bodies found hanging on the Sweetwater were only dummies. He says that Averill had been left a fortune by an uncle in Alaska and quietly slipped out of the country with the Watson woman. In writing up this extraordinary vagary, the Carbon County man says, "I know there are a few people who will not accept this statement as true." Right you are. There are more than a few.
Matt, do you think Kate could have alibied her way out of a long prison sentence had she been brought to trial?
No, Frankie, as the good book says, all they that live by the sword shall perish by the sword. There is no alibi for crime.